Welcome, 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 welcome back. So as we heard from the last panel, the conversation at the AI Summit is evolving in its acknowledgement that there is a need to address a broad set of potential cross-cutting challenges that are created by AI. From bias to data privacy to climate impact and misinformation. Our next conversation will reflect on this and consider how stakeholders across the AI ecosystem, from governments, industry, civil society, and indeed academia, can tackle the challenges together. Please join me in welcoming our next moderator to the stage, Greg Williams, Deputy Global Editor Director at Wired UK.
Everyone else is coming on. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And welcome, everyone, to the second session of the day. Really enjoyed the first session, a great conversation. We're billed as an expanded conversation. It's going to examine how we harness the benefits and address the challenges of AI. I'm delighted to welcome a hugely knowledgeable group with us today. I hope we're going to be able to get beyond some of the more kind of pessimistic prognostications and offer a real practical sense of how we approach AI as we move forward and how these summits might help to impact best practices. So I'm going to let the panel actually introduce themselves because I think they'll do a much better job of it than I will. So maybe, Polly, if we can start with you and we go along the group, if that's okay.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm Polly Curtis. I'm Chief Executive of the cross-party think tank Demos. We care about democracy and within that the impact of digital technology. But my background before Demos was as a journalist, so I have a keen interest in information environments and how journalism and news environments affect democracy as well.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Resham. I'm Global Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute. We're a not-for-profit that look at open data and now especially at how that reflects and impacts the data ecosystem when it comes to AI, because obviously without data we'd have no AI. I also sit on the Government Smart Data Council.
Thank you.
I'm Gina Neff. I am a professor at Cambridge and I run the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. We care about making technologies work for people, communities, and the planet. And we've got four kind of key initiatives that we're really working on. One is around making sure we expand the public conversation about the potential harms and benefits of our digital technologies, to improve trust in our information environments, to work on the future of work, and to really question some of the choices and challenges around the environmental impact of our digital technologies.
And I'm Tim Clement-Jones. I'm the former chair of the AI Select Committee in the House of Lords. In 2016, I set up, co-founded, and now chair the all-party group on artificial intelligence. Just by way of light relief, I wrote a book called Living with the Algorithm a couple of months ago. And in my spare time, I'm the DSIT spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. And just a word of warning, I'm a bit of an AI Safety Summit skeptic because I think that ethics are rather more important than safety, or at least they should take their place alongside ethics. And I think that the incorporation of ethics in standards is where we should be heading.
Okay, and just because he didn't mention it, obviously Tim's book is available at all good bookstores, wherever you get.
I knew it paid to advertise.
Thank you for that, Tim. So thank you guys for the introductions. I'm going to start with quite a general question, and maybe, I don't know, Gina, maybe you can start us off. So we've got a group of stakeholders here from across the AI ecosystem, government, civil society, academia. The conversation around AI sometimes is very fractured. And I just wondered, different group of people here today, how can people within the AI ecosystem work better together as a group?
Thanks. I think that's a great conversation, and I think the first step in that answer is happening right here. And it happened in this room in the autumn when we gathered for the first AI Fringe. When we put together the Fringe, the group of organizations involved in co-sponsoring, I work with Responsible AI UK, we're a co-sponsor, ODI is a co-sponsor, Milltown is a great convener. I think we were all surprised at what an incredible cohering of the ecosystem we had, and how exciting it was to see the energy that is here in the UK around these issues. What we saw were some of the questions that really drive our day-to-day work in tech policy just not being on the table at all at Bletchley. Some of the concerns from the Global South, not on the table at all at Bletchley. Concerns from civil society, trade unions, that was considered off topic. And yet people really want to have these conversations about AI. They're so important for us to think about the kinds of digital futures we want. And so I think one of the things we can celebrate is that we've come together to start these conversations. My worry, if I may, is that we might lose this opportunity. I think we've made the most of this in terms of playing the summit we were dealt. We were dealt a summit by a government who essentially did not want civil society in the room. And they listened very closely to the needs of industry. No offense, industry, but if we're going to make these decisions about our AI futures, we have to bring more stakeholders to the table. And so the opportunity we have in this country in the next, I don't know, months, that we'll wake up on July 5th and we'll say, oh, where's our tech policy? We absolutely need to be ready for autumn and beyond in terms of how we're going to make those choices here and what we're going to do around some of these issues that we're facing. So I think we've done a great job of bringing the community together. I think we have a lot more work to do.
Great, thank you, Gina. Resham, you were nodding along there. A lot of work to do still, do you think?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I agree with everything you said, just nodding along here. But different parts of the ecosystem bring different insights, different perspectives, different strengths, different levels of expertise. And actually, this is fantastic. We're really proud to be founding partners of the Fringe. But actually, the onus is still on external partners to bring together and to convene like this. And, you know, the ODI works very hard to convene our member organisations, and we do roundtables and events like this as well. But actually, the UK has a huge strength in terms of civil society, in terms of academia, in terms of research. And actually, any future government, whoever it is in a few weeks' time, really needs to leverage that. And it should be for government to work harder to convene and pull those views together. So actually, we need to look at the strengths we have as a country. We are one of the leading countries when it comes to AI regulation and in terms of AI companies and tech development. So actually, it's also the role modelling of that to be able to implement the right legislation. And when we look at the now fallen data protection bill, not only did that weaken the data ecosystem, removing things like the need for data protection officers, the need for data protection impact assessments, it is a fallacy to suggest that you can remove data protection but meanwhile strengthen the AI ecosystem, because they are the same ecosystem. If you weaken data, you weaken the AI that is built on top of it. And actually, I think civil society and academia has a huge amount to contribute in terms of bringing perspectives and insights into AI harms that are already being felt, particularly by marginalised communities. And so that DPDI bill was very proudly presented as designed by industry for industry. Well, that's great, but what about society? What about the people who will suffer harms? And we at the ODI, we wrote a policy manifesto which we presented in Parliament back in March, so do please check it out. It's not at all good bookstores, but it is on our website. And actually, we talk a lot there about kind of the principles we need in order to support a stronger data and AI ecosystem. And one of the things we talk about a lot there is trusted independent organisations. Yes. And actually, if you want trusted independent organisations to be able to make the case for society, for marginalised groups, for these harms that go beyond the safety issues that were talked about at Bletchley, then actually you have to make sure that there is funding available, that there is resource available. And when you look at what the US has done, $200 million to support AI for good, actually that's an example we should be following here in the UK, whereby it should not just be for a few well-funded organisations or big tech to influence and shape the discussion on ethics, on principles, on safety, but actually we should be empowering civil society and funding them where needed to be able to make those valuable contributions.
Thank you, Polly. did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was as colleagues were talking, I was thinking about how you build the culture for collaboration and the infrastructure for collaboration and even the language for collaboration. And just as a kind of very practical example, it reminds me of the early days when I was at The Guardian leading some of the digital transformation and trying to get journalists and technologists and audience insight people and the business people to work together to create the new form of journalism. That collaboration was really, really hard. It was the biggest risk and it's what caused the biggest problems. And I kind of, it's a little microcosm of what you now see playing out. But investing in building the infrastructure, the culture and the language around collaboration is absolutely critical, because otherwise the incentives to roll AI out in lots of different ways will be wrong. We need to reach the right incentive system for embedding it across the way we work.
Was there anything you learned during that period at The Guardian that you think can be applied?
There are literally some really practical things, like when you're starting any conversation, what are we talking about? Are we using the same language? Are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah.
And I've been in so many conversations around AI when you think they're talking about that and they're talking about that, and they don't really, they're not having the same conversation because AI and all the contexts it will be applied in require deep, deep specialism that is hard to think across those silos and join the dots and understand the different ways of working. And that's one of the key skills we need to bring these things together, is people who can read across different ways of working.
Yeah. Tim, I'd love to bring you in here. Obviously, in this conversation, regulation is a given. But I'd just love to get your perspective on, are there other frameworks or ideas that could help, like political agreements, bills of rights, education? What do we need?
Oh, I think you've got to think right across the board. I mean, I'm a big fan of having a proper digital literacy strategy, for instance. You can't have regulation without having a high degree of digital literacy as well. But there's a huge amount more consensus, and we've heard it on the panel just today, than people imagine, between business and civil society. I come across very few businesses who are opposed to regulation of AI in some shape or form. And I think we've really missed a trick over the last few years. We started off pretty well, I think, with our AI strategy. Come back to Theresa May, all is forgiven. She gave a speech at Davos in 2018, which actually was very well received, really fired the starting gun for a national AI strategy. And since then, we've been distracted. I mean, I hope, as one of the killers of the data protection bill, because it got lost in the wash-up, as Resham said. I mean, that was a total distraction. And we should, exactly as Resham said, we should have been looking at things like data communities, data institutions. We could have been the leader in that kind of area. And I hope that when we have a new government, we're going to have a focus on that sort of positive area of use of data, creating public trust in the use of data, because without that underlying public trust, people then won't have trust in the AI systems, whether it's predictive or large language models or whatever. Now, I could go on to talk about the wider ecosystem beyond the UK, but, at the moment, we've adopted an incredibly insular approach to this. And, that's why I regard the AI Safety Summit, the first AI Safety Summit, as being a bit of a distraction. I think it was really intriguing because they were looking at kind of existential risk and safety, as opposed to here, present risk, things like bias and ethics. And it was interesting that the South Koreans basically dropped the safety label, and it's an AI summit. And I hope that the French will take that further. And what we're going to be talking about is a much more ethical basis, something about convergence of international standards and so on, that will really take the international basis for all this forward, because, you know, an awful lot of what people want, both in civil society and in business, is a level of interoperability, of common standards, so that we know what we're grappling with. Because if you try and just regulate this on a territory-by-territory basis, we're not going to handle what big tech are doing. They're far more powerful than a single jurisdiction. But if we have a common form of approach to this, that could be extremely powerful. And of course, the one thing that has been put in place here is competition policy, a new ex-ante competition policy, which I think is a positive step. But that, for me, is one of the few positive steps alongside the Online Safety Act as well.
Resham, I'd love to bring you in here because Tim was talking a lot about data, and obviously, you know, the Open Data Institute focuses on building an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. Just give us your sense of why having open data is so crucial for developing AI that benefits society as a whole.
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the elements that Tim mentioned that is so important is the data literacy element, the digital literacy of that. But in terms of openness, we're asking people to trust a system that even developers don't fully understand what's happening in the black box. So it's a lot to ask. And actually, the more openness we can move towards, the more open data sets are, the more accessible they are, the more interoperable they are, the more government leads by example in terms of publishing these data sets, explaining how it uses AI, explaining where AI or automated decision where ADM's automated decision-making tools are used, and the impact on people, where people have opportunity to redress, to accountability, where people can understand. And when I say people can understand, often people talk about literacy in schools, data literacy in schools, and that's really important, sure. But you know, there are not that many parliamentarians who have anywhere close to Tim's level of knowledge. I mean, I said to Tim the first time I met him to talk about AI, I left, you know, kind of my head hurt by the end. It was just, there was so much knowledge there. But, you know, you go in to speak to parliamentarians who are having to legislate on data and AI, and they'll sit you down sometimes and say, what's AI? And it's great that they can ask that question, but actually the challenge is they have to ask that question. So actually, do the public trust that they can actually have regulation that suits their needs? So the more we can move towards these high quality, assured data sets, and we talk a lot, Tim mentioned kind of empowering communities, we talk a lot about participatory data. So at the ODI, we're doing a big program on participatory data. How can you empower communities? How can you engage with communities, particularly those who are likely to be impacted by biased data sets, by poor quality data sets, by synthetic data sets that might rely on, on examples that don't exist and then amplify biases. And the more open we are, including to academics and researchers, to really be able to rigorously assess the impacts, the better. And we're actually doing a big program of work at the moment on data-centric AI. And the element of that is to look at actually how do we build an ecosystem where there are safe and trustworthy data practices that mean that the foundation is there for AI, and a part of that is openness.
Jeannie, you wanted to jump in.
I wanted to bring a real-world example to exactly what Resham is saying. I helped to lead a European Union-funded project called AI for Trust. We're trying to build a platform-neutral mis- and disinformation tool that integrates with human fact-checkers and journalists, right? So it's an early detection, early warning system for misinformation, disinformation, that really brings that human-in-the-loop element. The thing that makes the project a little different is that it's working in European Union languages. So as you know, lots of good tools are out there in English, but move to Polish, Romanian, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and your tools, the number of tools you can use go down, the quality goes down. So this access to data issue has been one of the most central issues that we've had. So here we are, we have a group of AI experts across the EU and other associated countries, and our project was delayed 15 months because of a decision that Elon Musk made. So that we were locked out of the systems of being able to access Twitter data to train our tools on means that we can no longer, as an independent group, now design a tool that helps people read their own social media feeds. And you know, there's choices we can talk about, like what that means for the commercialization of data, but you know, we saw overnight the access to the science that we were trying to develop, the state of art that we're trying to develop, change because of our access to data. So that's just one of many examples that we can say of why researchers and other trusted independent groups need to have access to data sets. But if we don't have these high quality data, if we're only relying on the big US companies that are just scraping things up, we're going to miss the technical, the specific, the local, the engaged, the different kinds of sources of knowledge that we can do that will drive productivity and drive the kinds of services that we will see make these tools work and work for all of us. So it's not just a how do we know the world problem, it's how do we get AI that works for the world problem. And right now my fear is that we're ceding too much power to a handful of companies to tell us what they think is best about how this development should work. They're telling us how development should work because of what's best for their bottom lines. They're not telling us for how it works for marginalized communities, for people from small languages. And by small languages, I mean Polish and Greek.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Jean. Polly, I want to bring you in on the trust piece in a little bit, but Tim, you wanted to jump in.
I just wanted to follow up what Gina had to say, because that's exactly why I distrust great statements coming out of summits signed up to, voluntary agreements signed up to by big tech, because actually you need regulation, not just some voluntary agreement between a few big tech bros, basically. That's really important. But I wanted to raise, as well as data, the question of trust in use of intellectual property, because I kicked off, before I became a digital spokesperson and got involved in AI to a great extent, I was a creative industry spokesperson. So I'm very advertent to the fact that if you're not careful, large language models just hoover up great swathes of intellectual property without paying for it. To some extent, the horse has bolted, but it's very interesting to see that partly because of legal cases, you see OpenAI signing up with News Corp, signing up with the FT. Big question, how exclusive are those deals? What advantage does that give OpenAI versus Anthropic versus Google, whatever it may be? But at least there's a beginning of a recognition of the importance of actually paying for the intellectual property that this generative AI models use. And I think we need to go forward, make sure that it's much more transparent in terms of use as well. So again, I think that goes to the trust thing, trust aspect, which, I know Polly wants to come in on.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, Polly, this trust aspect, which I think is super important. Obviously, you're, at Demos, you're understanding like public mood. You understand what people are thinking about AI. How do you think, from your perspective, we can best promote sort of public awareness and understanding of AI technologies to address concerns and misconceptions maybe that are out there in the wider sphere?
Well, the lesson here is the post office that has cut through in a way that is really, really impactful for everyone who cares about this. People now understand the experience of computer says no, and I think people relate to that through their technological lives in lots and lots of different ways. So I think that has had an absolutely major impact on this from a public perspective. The participatory techniques that Reshan was talking about, that's kind of at the heart of what Demos does. We think that too many decisions are made by too few people in small spaces, and we're not listening to how it impacts on people and their experiences of it. So what we would advocate for is using kind of participatory processes to bring citizens into this conversation at scale and in ways that make it accessible, to negotiate what's acceptable and how people want their data to be used. By having an open and transparent conversation with the citizenry around that, that's how you build trust. But some damage has already been done with the post office.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what sorry, Ginny, I'll come to you in a second. What do you think the mechanism of that is? How does that conversation happen in the public sphere when we're often talking about people who maybe don't really have, access to information or a voice in the same way that people in this room do?
Well, don't get me started, because this is our favourite. How you involve the public in complex issues at different scales, at different points in policy making, in development, is like there's lots of different methodologies out there. But I think you have to approach it at lots of different levels and for lots of different purposes. Right. But I think doing something that's very visible and big, like a citizens' assembly around the use of health data.
Right.
Those kind of things. Things that feel really tangible to people, so people can understand how it affects their lives. But you can bring people on in accessible ways. They're never going to understand all the weightings of the models and all the things that I don't understand. And the public is probably cleverer than me on most of those things. But I think engaging in visible exercises that kind of open up this conversation and leave room for compromise as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeannie.
People are really savvy. They are really savvy about how data is being used in their own lives. So we worked over the last 12 months with the Trades Union Congress and a whole group of stakeholders pulling together voices from industry, civil society, and academic research, along with trade unionists, to say, how are algorithms being used in your workplace, and what would you want to see in an AI and work bill? We took this government at its word when they said they wanted a proportionate approach to AI regulation. They said, we don't need new regulation, we have regulation on the books. Okay, great. If that's our exam paper, what does it mean? The question is, what does it mean for UK employment law when we now have AI? And we went through and tried to figure out, okay, do we have a right to human review? We don't have that in UK law. Do trade unions and other workers have a right to get their data at work so that they can make choices and decisions in terms of, the data isn't being used just by employers, it's also being used by people who can do creative and inventive things with that anonymized data. They don't have that right. There are these rights. Do we have a right to make sure that any high-risk decision about us is explained to us in a way? What does explainability of AI mean in UK law? None of that is in UK law. By the way, what's the definition of AI in UK law? We don't have one. So we have work to do, even if we want to have a light touch approach to AI regulation. We have work to do that. And I was just going to say, when you work with people around these choices, like Polly was saying, having citizens' assemblies, we have methods that we can do to voice people's concerns. In fact, tomorrow, Responsible AI UK, which is one of the research groups that I help to lead, will be announcing a collaboration between the Alan Turing Institute, the Ada Lovelace Institute, and the Digital Good Network and others around how we develop the methods for public participation, public voices into AI. How do we bring that civil society and citizen approach into the decision makings? We've got some work to do in terms of building capacity and building methods there.
So I think, Tim, I'd love to come to you on this next question. Everyone in the group seems to have talked a lot about the way that maybe, Web 2.0 didn't go particularly well when it comes to the way that large organisations were effectively able to kind of form monopolies, and there's an enormous asymmetry in power and hoovering data up, that kind of thing. Tim, I'm just wondering, and please everyone else jump in, do you think there's a possibility that we enter a new kind of era of almost like tech feudalism, where a very small number of very large companies with enormous power, and we're seeing the same market players with, who have effective monopolies in areas like search or social media gathering around AI. How do we prevent that kind of era of tech feudalism kind of?
I think there's every possibility of that, but I'm a tech optimist, so I wouldn't be sitting there, trying to advocate regulation or legislation or fight back against the data protection bill unless I felt there was a way forward that was constructive and would actually benefit us, as well as having guardrails around the kinds of AI that we've been talking about, and the positive approach to the use of data that's been talked about as well. I just believe that we just have to start grabbing it much more carefully than we have previously, and we have to be more robust about it. We can't just simply assume that all regulation, for some reason, is the enemy of innovation. We have to ask ourselves, why are we innovating? What are we innovating for?
Yeah.
You know, this isn't just, innovation isn't value-free. We have to make sure that we regulate the innovations that are not for the benefit of humankind and start going from there. So there's a huge amount that we could be doing. And unfortunately, I think we've gone backwards over the previous couple of years. I hope that going forwards, we're going to be able to grab this. I have I love science fiction, and the kind of dystopian vision of the future is William Gibson's Neuromancer, the Sprawl trilogy, for instance, where actually, you've got 2 or 3 AI systems in the cloud, which are effectively what you have to belong to. You belong to one AI or another. It's a bit Coke and Pepsi, basically. And that is the kind of future that William Gibson, for heaven's sake, was writing about in the 80s. So, I'm quite influenced by the fact that our competition policy, our competition law, our digital markets law has to be fit for purpose. And we have to try and make sure that we're not just recreating, the duopoly effectively between Android and Apple, the cloud oligopoly, all the other, the social media monopolies basically that we've got as well. We've got to do better than that when it comes to AI, because AI is even more powerful than any of those technologies. So, we do have to mean this when we legislate, and so I think what the CMA is doing at the moment, we have to be very careful that it's doing the right thing.
Thank you. Rashmi, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, on the legislation element and AI being so powerful, I mean, whatever your view is, and I also am an optimist about the applications and what we can do if we get this right, but if you look at the pace of legislation and the ability for not just our government, but all governments to actually be able to effectively do it. Legislation has always been like driving, looking in the rearview mirror. You're always playing catch-up. And now the scale and pace of technological development is so fast that it's almost impossible to imagine what your legislation should be like now to future-proof it. And even if you know what it should be like, it can take years, and then you have an election, and, sometimes you're happy the legislation has fallen, and sometimes you're not. But, when we launched our policy event, we had representations kind of from Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative parties, and they had a really kind of passionate debate about how do you update the way in which we legislate in a manner that means that Parliament can react. So is it a question of amendable secondary legislation? Is it a question of joint committees? Is it a question of beefing up and empowering select committees? And actually, I think we need to have a look at the way in which we can legislate to tackle these technologies so that we can adapt and evolve and be able to react much more quickly than we currently have been able to. But in terms of the question of, the positive applications and explaining to people, scare stories will always get more attention in the papers than the good stuff. So, you read articles about how health data could be used to treat cancer much more quickly or diagnose it much more quickly. That's great, doesn't really get that much traction. You read a story in the paper about how the Princess of Wales's health data was accessed or leaked, and people are like, oh my God, if even she is not safe, my health data is not safe. And when I did a trip to Estonia to look at their digital work, they actually said to us, in the UK, your problem will be that people will not trust that their data is safe, especially their health data with the NHS, and you need to find a way as a country to make sure that that is taken seriously. And in Estonia, they told us about cases where doctors and nurses and medical staff are struck off for looking at patient data that they shouldn't be accessing, even if they don't leak it. And so I think we also have to think about what are the safeguards that will make the general public feel that their data is secure and therefore can be used for things like curing cancer or kind of at least being able to spot it. And the final challenge that I'd like to throw open there is AI could do a huge amount for us in education, for example. You can imagine it being like a personal assistant. Every child would be able to have, essentially a tutor that could help them work out through questions. We've trialled some. I got to use it at work, and the ODI has some learning tools that kind of marks your homework, teaches you how to do it better. I think I'm right in saying you can play around with it on our website. But it's really fascinating to see you can be taught like that. But who will decide on the subjective questions? Yes. Who will tell the systems or shape whether, the 6th of January in the US, was that freedom fighting? Was that, an act of crime? Was that something in between? And actually, we do have to think about, your definitions point. Who gets to decide what people view as truth? And right now, it will be big tech. And actually, that's a really serious question that we need to decide and think about who is going to shape the narrative as we go forward.
Polly, I'd love to bring you in on that, actually. If we're talking about, how we have a healthy information ecosystem, how do we combat the erosion of kind of public discourse, the erosion of truth? What's your perspective on that? How do we ensure that we have this healthy information ecosystem moving forward?
So I think, picking up on both the previous points as well, I think what you're seeing at the moment in the news industry is the news industry rushing to kind of form deals with the AI companies in order to get the value from their work, to get the commercial value out of their work, which is absolutely kind of the right thing to do. It's very much driven by this kind of trauma the industry has been through the disruption of social media. It is a traumatized industry that had its business model broken, has struggled to find new ways, and it's sitting on the precipice of a new wave of this and thinking it's going to be exactly the same. And so it's learned from the first time round and is doing those deals to get the money kind of out of it. But I think in that it's missing the opportunities to correct the wider problems around how people access information and see the positive potential within AI to fix the problems. We think about the information environments too much as how do we stop the bad stuff out there, rather than how do we use the technology to get the good stuff out there that will support our healthy democracy and help people understand the world we're in. And I think no one is talking about that. And in this rush to kind of commercialise the models in journalism, there's no incentive in there to go, how do we fix this system for democracy, not for a business model?
Sorry, Gina.
There's no rush to commercialize in Kenya or Guyana or South Africa, right? There's no rush to commercialize outside the US, the UK, and the EU and China. Different ecosystem. But to be fair, when we're talking about these kinds of licensing deals, we're carving up a very narrow swath of the globe. And if we want to stand for democracies worldwide, we have to absolutely be fighting for healthy information environments. It's something like for every dollar, I think I'm going to get the numbers right, that Meta gets $50 a year in advertising revenue for every US customer. They get pennies or pence for every sub-Saharan African internet user. They simply don't see the incentive in their bottom line to do the content moderation and safety. So we've got a big global problem that won't be resolved by that. And so this is why there's been calls for, how do we get better information about our global information environment? And our organization is very proud to be founding partners of the International Panel on the Information Environment, which is a global panel of scientists that will be producing and are producing high-level quality science about what is going on so that policymakers can take action.
Thank you, Gina. We're going to go to questions very shortly. So do please, be prepared to ask the panel some of your questions. I have one sort of question, though. I'd love all of you to sort of have a think about, if you don't mind. And Tim, maybe you can kick us off, and we'll go down the group. We have French representatives in the room, and I'd love it if you could give us a sense of what you think should be on the table or discussed at the next summit.
Well, I think we've got to take this a whole stage further, and I would use the epithet AI summit. I would have got rid of the safety aspects of it, because I think you tied that in with all the other aspects that are needed in terms of international convergence. And, whether it's civil society or business, we need that level of convergence. And I would say that if the subject of the next summit in France was about how we can get convergence on AI standards, that would be fantastic. So it would be getting agreement with the US, who've already got NIST producing a risk assessment framework. We've got Senelec doing similar for the AI Act. We've got ISO 42001. You know, we've got a whole number of risk assessment frameworks that if we could make them convergent, that would be really helpful. And we would do that for testing standards, training standards, audit standards, continuous monitoring standards. If we got that kind of commitment, and the OECD has started that process, and the OECD, you know, is effectively the secretariat for these aspects, that would be really helpful. The second thing, and funny enough, for me, the most productive element of the South Korean summit was what the OECD and the Korean government put together at the end, which was a digital bill of rights. They launched the Digital Bill of Rights together. Now, that struck me, rights-based regulation is really important. The Council of Europe has just published a framework convention. You know, this is looking at the right end of the telescope. How does it affect the individual citizen? So I would go for those international standards, and then I would look at what kinds of rights we need to enshrine in regulation for citizens, basically. And going forward with those two things would then create both certainty for business and public trust.
Thank you, Tim. Gina?
I would say what Tim said, and I would add that we still have a lot of work to do on how we get good socio-technical assessments. So what the first set of AI summits has helped us understand is the need for international cooperation around technical information around large foundational AI models. What I think we can add now is how do we develop best practices and tools that help us to assess impact on jobs, impact on citizens, impact on public services, impact on lives, and yes, impact on productivity. I think the stakes are so high that if we don't get some of these choices and challenges right, and we can't do it alone as individual states, we absolutely have to be doing this through international cooperation. If we don't get some of these choices and challenges right, then the potential of the enormous benefits that AI promises will never be realized. So I think this is I think the French summit will be a really pivotal time for us to expand that conversation on what those socio-technical monitoring of the impacts of AI will look like.
Thank you, Gina.
So 2 points. I mean, I agree with everything, so I'll make it different. One, I'd say this really needs, for me, really needs to be the summit where we talk about empowering communities and including civil society. There were a lot of complaints at Bletchley, and our counterparts for Seoul also had the same complaints that actually they weren't really included, and actually empowering those communities and civil society organisations to represent the harms, the risks, the challenges that are already being faced and will continue to be faced, I think would be hugely powerful, because actually that does need to be on the agenda, that does need to be discussed, and it really does need to be put to people kind of internationally as to how to find international solutions to these challenges. And the second thing, it won't surprise you, is the Open Data Institute, that we really think data needs to be on the agenda. So actually we are talking here about the data ecosystem, and it was referenced earlier by these brilliant panelists, but how do we make sure that the data sets are kind of high quality? What is the assurance process? Is there a standard? How do we make sure that they're explainable and accountable? What happens where there are biases? What are the opportunities there for people to get redress? And as you say, it's not in UK law, it's not in lots of other jurisdictions either, which actually means that people who are harmed, who have far fewer resources than big tech companies or governments, are unable to actually seek the redress for the harms they face. And they often don't even know they're facing them. So making those open to research and academia so that we can challenge and make sure that those harms are minimalised and addressed as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Polly.
And one kind of philosophical point and a linked kind of practical suggestion. The philosophical point is, if we're coordinating globally around this, what are we coordinating for? And around the world, you are seeing liberal democracies fraying, and the structures of how they work and operate fraying. And we need to understand what we're legislating for and agree some really high-level principles about what we want liberal democracies to be. Linked to that, a practical suggestion. I would love to see a global citizens' assembly precede the summit and the summit consider what people think in this. And I think kind of linking those things together with some of those high-level ideas would capture some of the themes that have been coming through today as well.
Yes. It's going to have to be a week long, this summit, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've just programmed the whole thing, so they've got no work left to do.
Well, thank you all for doing the work for our friends in France. We're going to open up now. A gentleman there at the front with a raised hand, and we'll come to you. And then we've got others, sorry. It's very dark in here.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question about what aspects of AI could both be industry killers and industry creators. And I think you've highlighted some of the ones there, but I raised a question recently about insurance and with business coaches recently, and we discovered that if a business coach is using AI is not compliant with the EU AI Act, for example, one, they may find claims not being paid out. Two, they might find their premiums go up. Three, they may have their insurance policy voided altogether. And last, worse, there's a possibility they may never get insurance again and not be allowed to practice. So just getting the one thing right with regards to being compliant and being able to get insurance like professional indemnity insurance and liability insurance could kill that industry if it's not worked within the right way. But if it is, whole new industries could emerge. And I'm just asking each of the people on the panel, in your experience, the things that you've come across, are there single factors that you know, if they're not taken care of, they could kill whole industries. But if they are taken care of, they could create whole new ones.
Gina.
I'll jump on that. I have just finished the first draft of my next book called Negotiating Innovation. And if I have one takeaway for this room and others, it is that when new technologies come into existing industries, one of the best things you can do is look at people on the front line working with those technologies to figure out what workarounds are they doing, how can we learn from them? Because technology adoption is a complicated and long process. My fear with AI right now is that we're at the beginning of that process. And if you look at companies doing their financial reporting right now, companies like Paycom, companies like Roblox, not the big AI players, but companies that are trying to use AI to make their own systems and their own services better, they're struggling. They're spending a lot of money. They're bringing on a whole set of new talent. And they're not seeing the impact yet on their bottom line. So we know this is going to be a long process for most companies. My answer on your industry killer, industry creator question, though, is the best economic data we have is that when it comes to jobs, there's going to be a net job increase. Now, that doesn't mean the transition isn't going to hurt many of us, that the tasks we do are going to be automated, but that the jobs themselves are going to change, and that composition of jobs, the tasks we do in each job is going to change. So companies, what they can do now is think about what is it we want to do? How is it we're going to make value in services? And I'll leave you with the concrete story from construction. I've spent 15 years studying digital transformation and high-end building construction. And when they started this process, they thought, we're going to automate construction planning. That's great. What they ended up with the process is hiring a whole bunch of digitally savvy people and creating what we now call digital twins. But they didn't completely automate that process. They didn't take people out of the process. They created a new set of services that we're just now beginning to understand how to do that. That's taken the trillion plus annual revenue of building construction industry globally. That's taken them over 20 years to figure out. So we're not going to get quick solutions. It's going to take time to figure these things out. But looking at that front line of work is going to help.
Tim, you want to jump?
Yeah, I think this has so many facets, but just two. I think we come back to the quality of data sets, the issue of inherent bias and impact assessment and so on, that the corporate insurer needs to be very, very clear about. But it comes back, I think, for me, particularly to the issue of redress. And this is where consumer redress is utterly crucial, and it's where the data protection bill, watering down subject rights in the face of automated decision making was completely wrong in my view. As you know, enshrined in Article 22 of the GDPR. I happen, amongst other things, to chair the Ombudsman for both the energy and communications industries. And alternative dispute resolution, if you like, an ombudsman, is absolutely crucial in those industries. If we didn't have it, it's bad enough people's trust in energy companies, which is pretty low. It's a bit higher in the mobile phone companies and the telephone service providers. But having a redress mechanism in the face of, which is much more powerful than anything in the GDPR currently, that's what we need to enshrine. It's really important. It's one of the OECD principles that were laid out in 2019, and we need to pursue that very vigorously. Otherwise, trust in a lot of those kinds of services, insurance being one of them, will ensue.
Question there, and then we'll come to you there, please. Well, okay, so we'll go to the gentleman here, and then we'll go row 4 back there, please.
Joe, I study ethics of AI as a master's student at Cambridge. I am fascinated by this project of AI for Trust. Because fact-checking seems like a really empowering solution to the really complex problem of misinformation. I've got, I think, quite a deep question about it, though. So the sort of the ideal fact-checking device might be one that, say, tracks or identifies AI-generated content, and Andy Parsons actually spoke at the last one of these with the Content Authenticity Initiative, and basically spotting generative AI, and that whatever's left after that isn't misinformation. But two problems with that. One is there's a decent chance that these algorithms are going to be able to game these systems the same way that large language models have brutally gamed plagiarism detectors in universities. And the other problem is it doesn't get at the really deep question, which is what is the ground truth that we're anchoring as a basis for fact-checking? Within organizations, it can be their internal data sets. I would say this is the truth, and then we test if this holds up to that. But of course, in the broader, democratic election, you've got this massively difficult question. So, I'm sorry to lay this massive question to you, but it's a project I have to take up. So I'd love if you speak to that.
I would love to, at depth and length, but we'll catch up on this one in Cambridge. I will say our answer is social network analysis, which, to bring the rest of you into the conversation, we can look at any one piece of information and ask, is it true, is it not true? Or we can say, is this piece of information acting like things that look like disinformation? And right now, the state of the science, we're pretty good on being able to say we know what the characteristics of disinformation are without even making truth claims on it. So happy to bring you into that, but that's how we're solving that problem.
Next question.
That and human in the loop.
On the fourth.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Tabitha Hart. I'm from Stop AIDS, which is a UK-based network working on HIV and also part of the Digital Health and Rights Project, where we do participatory research within LMI, within low and middle-income countries on the young people's experiences with digital technologies and how their perspectives on AI. So, many of the risks have been mentioned, and I won't go through all of them again, but issues for the marginalised and criminalised populations that we work with in HIV. There are a lot of concerns around data bias, around data privacy leaks, their participation in decision-making, and particularly in a shrinking civic space environment. So my question is around my concern, which is, what is the role for the UK government in terms of funding or pushing policy to support these issues and address these concerns of LMI within low and middle income countries?
I didn't catch all of that, I'm afraid. So maybe somebody else should kick off and I can riff off them. But I certainly was very conscious of data sharing by, for instance, the police in terms of AIDS, HIV information data when we had the passage of the data protection bill because certain forms of sharing were regarded as legitimate interests, and the law was being changed, and a balancing test was not being carried out. But I didn't quite get if you like, the other elements of the question.
So it was, what's the role in the UK government in funding that in lower and middle income countries?
Well, frankly, our aid budget seems to be taken up with paying for hotels for asylum seekers, as far as I can make out. If we actually went back to some respectable percentage of our GDP, maybe we should start doing the right thing in overseas countries of that kind.
I mean, yes, I'd wholeheartedly bring back 0.7, but also what I will say is, interestingly, on that, the end part of your question, actually, there are a lot of countries that look to the UK's legislation in order to kind of leapfrog and piggyback and pick out the things that work for them. And so actually, I think one of the best ways in which we could support other countries, particularly those that are looking to the UK's legislative agenda as kind of an example, is to make sure we get it right here, because actually it's much easier to copy-paste existing legislation and just tweak and adapt rather than having to start from scratch. Of course, you need to adapt to make sure it fits different countries' ecosystems. But actually, one of the best things we can do that's an easier sell than funding it elsewhere is making sure we fund it here, get it right here, yes. And then we need far less of a top-up budget to be able to say, this is the tweak you need, like, you know, the icing on the cake, rather than baking the whole cake internationally.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one question over there, maybe, sorry, right at the end.
Thank you. It's easy to criticise industry, but aren't we still just playing their game? I mean, we parrot the idea that this is super complicated and we need to know more. But if we're honest with ourselves, don't we know enough? Take bias. We have, as civil society, we have access to data that tech companies don't have, real life data, and more people are telling us that they aren't getting jobs and are being discriminated against from protected characteristics. And even though the UK has incredible anti-discrimination law, we don't mention this. We don't talk about how tech is breaking existing law today. And so my question is, how can citizens trust the civil society groups talking about AI as more and more of us learn the hard way that we're actually not protected on even the basic things that we've always been promised?
How can civil society trust some of the mechanisms that we have in place?
Yeah, well, it partly depends on enforcement of existing law. And funnily enough, Equality and Human Rights Commission, I mean, they actually are more proactive than they have been for a long time. I would give them more teeth on these sorts of issues to do with bias in data sets, but because a gap analysis would show that actually the enforcement of that kind of issue is not sufficient currently, and yet that is going to rise to the top, particularly the more that these data sets are used in conjunction with predictive AI to make decisions on things like social security payments and so on. So I do think that's really important, but you can't avoid the fact that actually you need new legislation as well, because if you do a gap analysis, there is some protection against bias, but actually what you need is transparency, you need accountability, you need liability injected in there as well, together with, as I said earlier, redress. So it's inescapable that we need new legislation as well as enforcing existing legislation to a greater extent. There's one other thing I should add. Gina's mentioned the whole question of researcher access to social media in particular. Unfortunately, that was one of the areas that fell in the data protection bill, because I think that's one area that we could possibly have got through the House of Lords, and I think the government would have given way on that. But I do think that general principle of having access to what is actually happening inside some of these large language models, generative AI models, predictive AI models, to see how they're weighted in terms of decision making, to seeing what kind of data they're ingesting and so on, is really important. And just simply relying on the big tech companies is not going to be good enough. You know, we're going to need some independent audit to make sure that we know what's happening there.
Thank you, Tim. We're nearly out of time, but Gina and Resham, you both want to come in on this.
The shortest answer is there is a powerful and unfortunately very overly rosy story that is being told that AI solves problems. Every problem we have, oh, AI will do that. Productivity, AI. Fix the healthcare, fix the NHS, AI. Fix our roads, AI. Fix our environment, AI. Let's throw AI at it. And that's not going to work, very simply. I think the point that you've raised is so important. It's taken the group that we co-convened. It took us 9 months to do that gap analysis in UK law, to say, what do we have in place that protects us from discrimination in AI systems, and what's the new thing we need? And we published an AI and employment bill that's a draft that's free for anybody to pick up and run with to kind of counter that. I think the longer answer is we're going to absolutely need more public citizen voices in the discussions around AI. And if we continue organizing summits like happened at Bletchley, that's not going to happen. So my hope, looking forward to the French summit, is that we make sure that we get those voices globally at the table so we can have the real conversations about the problems people want to solve.
Thank you, Gina. Resham, final word to you.
Yes, I'll keep it very quick. You're absolutely right. We know plenty. There's always more we can know, but we don't want to be one of those kind of groups where we're always like, we have to wait till we know everything. What I will say, though, in defence of civil society is the pressure on resources is significant. So government funding has been cut for many years. And if I look at last year as an example, we averaged, in the UK alone, forget if you want to influence European law and American law and international, we averaged a UK government consultation every 3 weeks for 10 months last year on data and AI. And so actually, as a civil society organisation that has little government funding or external support, you're really having to make choices, like how much time does it take to submit a consultation on how data is used in education or how data is kept and shared by government. And in addition to that, we also had the Data Protection Bill, the AI White Paper. So actually, when you want to go in to advocate for communities and for society to Parliament, you're competing with these big tech teams who, you know, might have 10 people working on data privacy, and you have 1 or 2 people working on all matters in policy and legislation. And so actually, you know, people like Tim work really hard to reach out to civil society, but it is a very challenging thing to compete with massive teams. And so it's not for lack of wanting to, it's not holding back because we don't think it's important or that we know enough. It literally is the challenge of too many things to do, and there's opportunity costs. So actually it comes back to the plea that's also in our policy manifesto, that if we want a stronger ecosystem, if we want to really represent communities, we have to have strong, trusted and funded independent organisations that can make those representations, because there's only so much we can currently do.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. Oh, a round of applause. Great start speech. We're out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through more. Thank you to an amazing panel. I just thought it was a very lively conversation, but also so practical. I really feel like you've really kind of like mapped out so many ways that we can move forward, and hopefully the work can continue in France. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our amazing panel.